foundation, at least no foundation has been proffered as to how she would know the details of any individuals other than her own patients or this defendant's mental condition. Famous people, what this doctor may have learned through newspaper articles or other publicly available information, absent, I don't think is sufficient foundation for her to testify as to anything. It is not a rebuttal to what Dr. Browning or Huey testified to. She wants to say that no, in fact, people with bipolar can function in a work environment, and that's certainly a sore rebuttal. But individuals to whom this witness has no personal knowledge, firsthand knowledge, or a foundation to opine as to what type of mental illness and how they're able to function, I think that's improper.
Ms. Sampson, anything else?
Well, she is, in terms of foundation, she is able to testify as to the research, the literature. She is not limited to things that she has personal knowledge of in terms of basing her opinion or in terms of her testimony. She can testify to research.
Research, I may agree with the research. We said literature now. If she has not either A, studied these individuals' case files or B, interviewed them or did an examination, I'm just using that as example. She can't rely upon what someone may have read in the National Enquirer as someone's mental health state and say, this is a famous person and this is their mental health state. So now, if she's relying upon, as you're saying, a treatise by an expert, but the National, I'm not knocking the National Enquirer, so people may believe that information. I'm not saying it's not true, but I don't think you can just rely upon a quote-unquote tabloid representation of what quote-unquote a famous person's mental health condition may or may not have been. But now, if you can lay a foundation, I may let you ask that question, but if the source is the National Enquirer, that's off the top of my head, or I can't think of all these magazines and news, pure articles that are at the newsstand. I call it newsstand, but when you're at the checkout counter at the grocery store, if that's the foundation, I'm going to deny that motion as far as your ability to ask her that question. So now, if you can lay a foundation that she either A, reviewed a record or reviewed a recognized periodical by some expert, and National Enquirer is not going to be an expert. But if you lay a foundation, I'll allow you to make that inquiry. But now I'm not going to let you just drop someone's name, and I have no idea whose name you may or may not use unless there's a foundation. So, anything else? So I'm going to deny your request unless, and I said the caveat is unless you can lay a proper foundation. But I want that foundation laid before someone's name is mentioned.
Okay.
Any other questions about what I said?
No, sir.
All right. Anything else from the state about that issue?
No, sir.
All right. Lawyers, any other issues that I want to bring before we bring up the jury and continue with?
No, Your Honor. Can I just have 2 minutes with my
Oh, yes, you can take those times you need. Mr. Brown, anything else for the record?
No, Your Honor. Thank you.
Mr. Land, anything else for the record?
Okay.
All right. What I would do, yes, counsel, what I would do is definitely more welcome back. I will step away when the defense is ready to proceed. Go ahead and put the jury in the box, and I'll come back out. But you can take it. I'm not rushing anyone. Take as much time as you need, but I do want to proceed. Is everyone ready with that caveat of 2 or 3 minutes?
Yes, sir.
All right. And just for that's what I was going to ask how many potential rebuttal witnesses, but just have them ready. All right. Deputy Moore, let me know when they're ready.
All rise. All rise. Court comes to order.
Hi, good morning. You may be seated. All right, Kelly, we're back on the record. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for returning on time. Thank you for your attentiveness. The state has rested on this rebuttal. Now we turn our attention. Is there any additional witnesses from the defense?
I'm sorry, Judge.
Sure. Are there any additional witnesses from the defense?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right, you may call your next witness.
Your Honor, who would call Dr. Adriana Flores?
All right, you may come up. Do you want the screen down?
Yes, Your Honor.
Raise your right hand. You solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you give to the court shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
I do.
State your name for the court.
Dr. Adriana Flores, Adriana, F as in Frank, Lores.
The device, you have on up there, counsel. That's up there.
It's not straight, but it's on.
Okay. This is something, there's a different remote for the overhead unit.
It's usually over here.
May have point in the direction of the unit overhead. Maybe. It should have a button on it that's normally say on or off.
Well, it's got.
If you depress it, you can put pressure on it.
Yes, I've done that.
No, it's on there.
Oh, it is?
The pressure that you have put on that button has made it on.
Okay. Sorry, Judge. I'm used to getting here, and the deputy is taking care of that, and I didn't do it ahead.
No problem. We ever feel it. We'll blame Deputy Moore.
Dr. Flores, you indicated that among the records you have reviewed in this case that you included records of the evaluation of Hemy done in the case by Dr. Joe Browning and Dr. Don Huey. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
And as part of your review of the case, have you had sufficient time to read and carefully review those records provided to us of Joe Browning and Don Huey's evaluation in this case?
Yes, I have.
They spent 3 hours and 20 minutes with Mr. Neuman. Is that sufficient for a complete evaluation?
Objection, Your Honor. That's speculation.
Yes. I want to state that, Judge. You may want to rephrase that question about her experience and expertise. But anyway, it's the same. Answer that question.
In,
Rephrase, please.
in terms of the norms of doing a forensic evaluation and what was required in this case, would that be consistent with the norms or consistent with what you would expect in this case to give an evaluation?
I do not believe so. I think that given the complexity and the amount of information in this case, 3 hours is in my opinion, insufficient time. It would have taken a lot longer to do a more comprehensive, adequate evaluation of Mr. Neumann.
And how many hours did you spend with Mr. Neumann?
I spent a total of 18 hours, one-to-one with him.
And back in 2011 when this happened, how many hours did you spend?
12 hours in 2011 and 6 hours this year.
Given what they did in this case, let's talk about what else they could have done or should have done. Did they have the time or were they able to dig into the prior incidents that you looked at?
Question, Your Honor. Speculation.
Sustained. I'll rephrase that question.
Given their report, did you see evidence that they did what you did in terms of looking for support and looking for confirmation of the incidents he told you about in his past?
No, there is not. The timeline that we put up, that I developed, that I put up, I think, on Monday, mixed up about what date this week is, but the very first day that I testified, there was a timeline that delineated each time that he had either an episode of really high energy or a depressive episode, and I went through each of those one by one, and that is part of a really comprehensive evaluation, which Dr. Huey and Dr. Browning did not do. If they had, they would have seen that same sort of timeline.
Objection, Your Honor. Speculation.
Sustained. Rephrase that
Did
question.
you what data did you have that they do not list on what they reviewed that helped you to corroborate or to evaluate those early incidents?
I interviewed family members. That was critical in substantiating whether or not, in fact, he was reporting information that was true. I reviewed, as an example, the transcript that correlated with a depressive episode that he reported to me and the family also reported to me. I reviewed the records from the most recent treatment facility that he's been at that actually documents, and I read it the other day, where the doctor actually put on there that the pressured speech was noticeable, and there was also some evidence of hypersexuality. That's evidence of a manic episode. I interviewed Dr. Jerkovic, who was somebody that provided treatment for him, or evaluated him, I should say, back in 2011, December of 2011, and I actually interviewed her personally. I interviewed personally a GE employee that worked closely with Mr. Neumann. I reviewed transcripts from the previous hearing from both Dr. Crawford and also Dr. Tracy Marks. Dr. Tracy Marks' testimony was particularly important and relevant in terms of substantiating some of what I had seen in delusions that he was still experiencing in 2011. So those were some additional data that I reviewed.
What about family members?
I interviewed multiple family members, his mom, his dad, his sister, an aunt, a cousin's wife. So I spent hours interviewing these individuals and getting not only his history to see if it corroborated with what he was reporting to me, but also specific in that timeline, asking about whether they had ever noticed specific signs or symptoms or behaviors at different periods of time. And I was not, I would ask him, for example, in 2008, when the graduation was occurring of one of his children, did you notice anything different about him? And so it was sort of open-ended questions to see what they would indicate, and it was consistent in that case with a manic episode. And that's kind of how it went with these interviews. The family history is really important. The research actually tells us that it's very easy to miss a diagnosis of bipolar disorder if you do not take family history into account. And so contacting the family and actually finding out that in fact there is a family history of
Objection,
bipolar
Your
disorder.
Honor.
I'm
Objection.
sorry, what's the objection?
The objection is to hearsay as to this witness's basis for knowledge for the assertion of the issues about you.
Response.
I'll move on.
All right, hearing no response, sustain the objection. Let's move on.
Dr. Browning testified that he was not given the transcripts from Georgia Tech. Was that important to you?
It was, because it is, it really is about putting together a puzzle sometimes when it's a complex case. Some cases are really easy to figure out. Some cases are more complex. This one's one that has what I call a lot of smoke around it because of the whole love triangle. And so it really is you really have to look at it much more critically and much more in depth and much more comprehensively. And so looking at any little detail that can either corroborate or not corroborate. So you've got two ways to go. Either, yes, he really does suffer from a real illness, or no, he's actually faking. And you've got to consider both of those things. And any little piece of data that you can possibly access and review that can tell you whether you're on the right track or the wrong track is important to consider. So as little as looking at a transcript may seem, it is an important component of that evaluation and arriving at your opinion more confidently.
And if they did not go into detail of the symptoms that he showed with him, of the symptoms that he showed after his arrest, you talked about David Maliki and the Torah and masturbation. Is that something that they should have done?
Most definitely.
Your Honor, to what they should have done.
Sustain. You want to rephrase that question?
Is that something that you feel would have impacted their opinion if they had done?
I object, Your Honor. That's speculation.
Yes. Does she feel sustained? You want to rephrase that question?
Are those factors things that were important in your opinion?
They are. The evaluation really needs to include not just up until what was happening in 2010, but it needs to include all the way until present. So you're looking at whether or not, if there were any symptoms present, that they all of a sudden resolved in 2010, or do we have more evidence? And the documentation in this particular case tells us we have documents actually from a treatment provider that says that in fact there is evidence of some continued problems with bipolar disorder. And then you have his own reports. Unfortunately, the other piece that they did not have because they didn't have the benefit of time is that in 2011, they didn't have the benefit that I did of actually evaluating him in a time that was closer to the time of the event, where I actually saw for myself the problems with his thinking, the fact that he still was holding on to some delusional thoughts.
If they did not ask him how he felt after the failed attempt, the first attempt on Rusty, is that something that was important to your opinion?
It is important because it goes to it would have led them to a whole series of questions about the delusion.
Objection, speculation. I think that's non-responsive to the question.
Sustain and sustain, both of those.
Did it lead you to something important?
It did. It led me into a whole series of questions where I could inquire more about the delusion and about his need or not need to act on it.
Okay. And were you able to confirm the failed attempt through the police reports?
I was. It was well documented. It was there. And the reports on the police reports were exactly as he related to me.
Did you, if they did not ask how he felt when he saw the children after the event or thinking about the children after the event, are there things that would have led to that were important to you?
Yes. Again, it's going further into the delusion and getting as much information as you possibly can.
If they did not fully assess for hypersexuality and previous incidents of hypersexuality, is that information that was important to you in your opinion?
It is, because that is one of the ways that his manic and hypomanic episodes tend to present with hypersexuality. So learning that, in fact, the hypersexuality was not just present in 2010 10, when he was having a relationship with Miss Sneiderman, that in fact these are issues that he's struggled with in the past in his relationship with his wife, that per his description was sexually satisfying, and yet he still had this excessive need to continue having sex even after he was satisfied.
If they did not fully assess for hyperreligiosity and how it affected him not only at the time but before and after, and even after his arrest, is that something that was important to your opinion?
It is, because that is another one of the prime symptoms that he displays when he becomes manic or hypomanic. As I described in one of the charts that we put up, I believe on Monday, there are a number of symptoms that can be present, but all of them do not have to be present. So you're looking specifically which ones are the ones this particular individual tends to present with. And for him, that is one of the prime symptoms that he experiences. Hypersexuality, hyperreligiosity, just overly focused on those two things is one of the prime symptoms.
If they did not fully assess or go in great depth into issues of sleep, is that something that was important to you?
It is, because that is another one of the symptoms that he experiences, where he can go without sleep and still be highly energized. He can sleep just 2, 3, 4 hours and still be able to function at full speed the following day. And that is, again, that's one of those symptoms that for him is important to assess, because that is one of the ways in which his illness manifests. And it may not in everybody. Not everybody with bipolar disorder will have that. That tends to be one of the symptoms, but not necessarily, because you only have to have a certain number, 3 out of the 7 or 8. And for him, that is one of the symptoms. So if you miss that, you're missing one of the symptoms, and then you could easily arrive at no, does not meet the diagnosis.
If they did not spend a lot of time on or fully evaluate the incident where they moved to Boca Raton, is that something that is important to your opinion?
It is, because that goes actually to, it wasn't just that he moved, it's all the circumstances surrounding the move. And when you look at it as a whole, if you miss it, what you're missing is an incident of a symptom, which is the risk-taking, that at that point presented as a risk-taking. It doesn't always for him, but that year, risk-taking was one of the things that he actually engaged in. If they had also not assessed, for example, I didn't see any assessment of, I don't recall seeing any assessment of him doing the day trading for millions of dollars. And that's something else that, again, is a symptom, because that goes into risk-taking. So if you miss those, if you're looking for all 7, that's going to be a problem. But if the individual is really presenting with 3 or 4, and you miss even one of those, assessing even one of those things that he presents with, you're going to not diagnose bipolar disorder.
Now, you've seen the list of materials that they reviewed in this case, correct?
Yes, I have.
What else did you review or do beyond that? We touched on some of those, but...
Well, I think a big difference is the fact that my evaluation, I do believe, was much more thorough. That I was looking at actually a timeline to see if I could establish a pattern in terms of whether or not he actually had these high episodes and these low episodes, and then to corroborate that information. So I do have, I think, enough evidence that takes us back to when he was 13, when he experienced the first depressive episode, and then a couple years later when he experienced the manic episode. So the history, I think, is really critical in this case. The fact that bipolar did not just appear at age 40-something, but we've actually got evidence going back to age 13. The fact that the trauma history, I think, is really critical, because it is well documented. It's documented in treatment in 3 sets of treatment records, and that is important, because if they had gotten, for example, a history from Mr. Neuman, I didn't see any indication that they even knew about this mother figure called Millie. And which is huge, because when she died, that was in essence sort of what turned on the, that's where it shifted it from this sort of depression to the mania. And the trauma history is really, really critical, and I really didn't see an in-depth analysis of whether or not there was in fact any trauma history. And as I alluded to earlier, in earlier testimony, we know that trauma is in fact correlated to psychosis. There's extensive research on this. So we know that just having the trauma history can actually predispose, can make somebody vulnerable to develop a mental illness, and that mental illness can in fact present with things such as hallucinations and delusions and bipolar disorder. And I didn't see any indication of them really looking in depth into his trauma history. So there's multiple pieces here that we're missing that I think, again, if you look at it sort of at a puzzle, it's each piece, as each piece goes in, either the picture is making sense or it's not making sense. But if you're missing the pieces to the puzzle, it's not going to make sense. It's not all going to be there. And if it's not all going to be there, you're not going to see what you really have.
Okay. Could you possibly have reviewed the materials that you watched or reviewed, setting aside all your interviews, just the materials that you reviewed in 2 weeks between June 15th and June 30th while working a full-time job?
Objection, irrelevance.
Why is this relevant for what we
You're-
asked her?
She has seen the materials, she has read the materials, she has lived with the materials. She can talk about the amount of time it takes to review those materials and whether Dr. Browning and Dr. Huey both said that they reviewed all of the materials
Well, I understand
between...
objection, counsel, but as far as the way you phrase that question for her, I'm going to sustain that objection. You can ask her as much as you wish about how much time she spent. Go ahead.
How long did it take you to review just the materials, not all the interviews, but the materials?
Well, I interviewed him 18 hours. So to review the materials and whatnot, I've estimated 200 to 220 hours. It's probably on the low end because I've been with this case since 2011. So from 2011 to 2012, and then again this year I spent on and off between 2 and 3 months. So it's a lot of data. And it takes a lot of time to review it. And I do have the benefit of being able to devote, because I am in private practice, to devote the time that I needed to this particular case. I don't think I would have been able to do it had I had adequately if I had been working a full-time job also.
If you had been hired if you had not been on this case in 2011, but you came into this case in 2016 as a state expert, would you have done additional testing or additional things on the case?
Objection, Your Honor. I think that's speculation.
I heard the question, Counselor, and I heard the way it was phrased. I'm going to sustain that objection. You want to rephrase that question?
Do you see things, in terms of the testing, do you see things that you feel might have changed their opinion or affected their opinion if they had done beyond what they did?
Your Honor, objection, speculation.
Counselor, didn't you just ask her what? I heard the question. Sustain. Rephrase that question.
As a psychologist, would you ever come in and testify on a case like this without doing any testing of your own?
No, I would not. Absolutely not. Regardless of how recent or how distant the instant event was, as a psychologist, I am able to do testing, and I always do testing. You want to know, not just, it's an important piece to see if you've got anything here, at least do an assessment of malingering, especially if you're going with a malingering hypothesis. Why not assess for malingering? Because he's saying that they're saying that he's saying, I had bipolar disorder back in 2010. Well, the records also say that he has bipolar disorder now. His reports are saying that he actually still suffers from bipolar disorder. So why not assess for malingering? Why not take a look to see if his current symptoms are actually faked or not faked? That would give you additional data. I don't understand why anybody would not do testing, their own testing. It is really important data, and I don't get it. I don't understand why anybody would do that.
Does the fact that you gave the Sears in 2011 somehow prevent them from giving it in 2016?
No. There are some tests in which you cannot give within a specified amount of time. It's been, 5 years? 5 years, they could have given any of those tests. They could have given the CIRS, which is the malingering inventory, the really in-depth one. They could have given the MFAS, which is the other malingering inventory, and they could certainly have given also the MCMI, which is the one that would have given them some insight and information about whether or not he actually has currently any issues with any psychiatric problems, including bipolar disorder, and also would have given them an additional indicator. It makes no sense.
If for some reason they didn't want to redo any of the tests you did, are there other tests out there for malingering?
Certainly. There are multiple tests that they could have given. They could have given the SIMS. That's another inventory for malingering that's out there. They could have given him an MMPI, and it's another personality. It's kind of like the MCMI. It's another personality and psychopathology inventory that has validity indicators. So they could have chosen tests that I didn't give. There was no reason for them to not give.
Objection, speculation.
Stay on that portion.
Question.
When you can finish, I mean, if it has something to do with that, the last question, but the last answer I'm going to sustain, the portion of it.
Okay.
Next question.
Have you ever been called on by a psychiatrist to consult or to team up on an evaluation?
I have, multiple times. Multiple times I've had psychiatrists that contact me because they want the information that only a psychologist can obtain through psychological testing.
And when you do that, how do you do that? How do you structure that?
The way it's structured typically is if a psychiatrist contacts me and they're doing an evaluation, let's say for insanity, I will do the psychological testing. I will do my own interview separate from them because I don't want to be biased in any way with my interpretation of what I am seeing. It actually is, I want my own independent opinion, and so what I do is I will evaluate the person on my own, separate from my colleague. My colleague will do their own thing. If it's, let's say, competency to stand trial evaluation or insanity, I will do the testing. I will then share the information about the testing, including malingering, which is the testing that psychologists can do and psychiatrists typically cannot do because they have not had the training. And I will give that information to the psychiatrist, but the psychiatrist will be the one to render if what she has been hired for, or what we have been hired for, is to render an independent opinion. There will be one opinion. It will be given by the psychiatrist with my findings in there, not with regard to the final issue in terms of, let's say, insanity or criminal or competency. It'll be her opinion or his opinion. But my information about the psychological testing will be in there in terms of, do I see, for example, any issues with intelligence? Do I see any issues with malingering? Do I see any issues with any current psychopathology or any personality issues? So my data is something that informs that psychiatrist in making their opinion, but they will arrive at one opinion, and it's an independently arrived opinion, which is very different from two people going in and collaborating on a case. That is not two opinions. That really is one opinion that two people have worked on together. Very different. And I do not feel comfortable doing that.
Objection.
What's the objection?
The objection is to the relevance of what she feels comfortable doing.
Sustain.
Have you
Next
ever
question.
have you ever signed off on or done a joint report with another psychiatrist on a forensic evaluation?
I'm trying to think if I signed off. I may have, but it will very clearly say that it'll clearly say psychological testing conducted by Dr. Flores, ...
And when you were at Georgia Regional, were you ever asked to do a joint or a single report on an opinion with another doctor?
Not in an opinion. Not in an opinion. The opinion, when I work there, at this particular hospital, they tend to have the psychiatrist give the opinion. And so the opinion would be from them. My testing results would be in there as part of the process. But I would not co-sign the report. The only time that I co-sign a report is if I have, for example, a student that is not licensed yet, a postdoctoral fellow that is not yet licensed. And so then ethically I'm supposed, and according to licensing requirements, I need to co-sign. But other than that, I don't, because I think it can be very misleading in terms of...
Objection.
Next question.
While you were at Georgia Regional, did you ever do a joint evaluation in terms of the interview with the client with another doctor, other than one of these fellows that you were training?
Objection, Your Honor, for relevance.
Sustained.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about symptoms. Dr. Huey and Dr. Browning described bipolar and manic symptoms as much more extreme than your description. Is there a reason why that might be?
Objection. Speculation as to why someone else...
I'm going to sustain that. You have to go for opinion. But sustain that objection.
Is there a difference in the population that they treat and the wider population?
Objection, Your Honor.
Is there a difference between the wider population and the population they treat? Sustain. Rephrase that question.
In
Come on,
terms,
minute, lawyers. You may continue.
the population of patients that you saw and the experience that you had with bipolar disease while you were working at Georgia Regional Hospital, is that typical of bipolar patients as a whole?
It is not. The patients that present in a hospital, by definition, according to DSM, must be presenting with a subset of symptoms that are so severe that they require hospitalization, which is one of the criteria that can be present, but it doesn't need to. It might help us if we put up the actual criteria, because that is one subset, but it need not be. And the patients that present in the hospital.
Objections to relevance.
Mr. Sampson, as well as that last, the response about the typical patient that presents in the hospital, I'm sorry, why is that relevant? If you tell me right now, please.
Your Honor, it goes to what types of patients Dr. Browning and Dr. Huey would have experience with.
Then that's a question that should have been asked of Dr. Browning or Dr. Huey, not this witness.
I'm going to sustain that objection.
If Dr. Huey said that you can go undiagnosed with bipolar 2 symptoms, but bipolar 1 people you would notice the symptoms immediately, does the research support that?
No, the research does not support that. It's incorrect. There's actually research, more recent research actually, that has found, this is research that's in peer-reviewed journals, the journals that are really critically looked at. This is good, solid research. One of them was actually from 2011. It was in Archives of General Psychiatry, and it found with 5,000 individuals presenting to the regular doctor just with symptoms of depression, about half of those had bipolar disorder. And some of those included bipolar 1 disorder that had not been diagnosed. There's another study, and that one actually is a huge study. 5,000 participants is a very large study, and it actually even has a name, the Bridge Study, and it was widely disseminated in the psychiatric community because it's so easy to miss bipolar disorder, including bipolar 1 disorder. And if you miss it and you're prescribing antidepressant, for bipolar, with only antidepressant medication to somebody that has bipolar disorder, what it'll actually lead to is for them to actually experience manic episodes. It'll bring out the manic episodes. So it's very important to understand that actually bipolar disorder and the way it presents can actually go under the radar and can actually go undiagnosed. So there's another study from 2004 in the Bipolar Disorders Journal. And that one's another big study, 1,630 people. And out of those, 25.6% of those people were undiagnosed specifically with bipolar 1. So Dr. Huey's incorrect when he says that bipolar 2 can go undiagnosed, but not bipolar 1. Research clearly tells us that he's wrong.
And does that fit with a description of mania being, or bipolar being obvious the moment you walk into a ward or a room with a
I
group?
object to that characterization of the previous testimony. The previous testimony wasn't that bipolar is obvious to someone. Previous testimony, as my recollection is that it was a manic episode, so I'm experiencing manic symptoms.
I'm going to overrule that objection. The jury will make a determination on what they did and did not hear. Go ahead and ask that question if you wish.
Does that fit with a description of someone who is bipolar being obvious the moment you walk into a ward or a group of individuals?
This tells us that it does not fit. This tells us actually that it can go under the radar, that it can go undiagnosed, including the higher activity levels of bipolar 1 compared to bipolar 2. So that's why it gets misdiagnosed, because the complexity about this particular disorder, and part of the reason why it goes undiagnosed, is because what you're looking at is in order for somebody to meet this criteria, you're looking for 1 week of symptoms. So if this individual presents to you outside of that 1 week of symptoms, or if those symptoms are symptoms that you do not see, like their hypersexuality or the fact that they're not sleeping at night, those are not things that are readily apparent. But if those things are symptoms that the person's experiencing that either are not apparent to you, or that you are seeing the person outside of that window of when they're experiencing those symptoms, you're not going to see anything. They're going to look more like that Mayo Clinic sign where it's green, where it's kind of more in the middle, it's more normal mood. And so that is why we have these really high numbers of undiagnosed individuals with bipolar disorder, because this is not like having cancer, where you have cancer and if it's untreated, it's there and you see it. This is one of those illnesses where it comes and goes, and the symptoms can vary. So you do not necessarily, you're not necessarily going to have the symptoms of sort of a manic or hypomanic episode present all the time and at the highest levels. You're looking for 1 week, and then they can go back down. And you're also looking at the symptoms that they're experiencing are not necessarily noticeable. There is nothing that says in the DSM-4, which is our diagnostic manual, there's nothing that says there the symptoms must be noticeable to others. And it doesn't. because some of those symptoms are not noticeable to others, like lack of sleep, or hypersexuality, or hyperreligiosity, as examples.
So if Dr. Browning testified that mania would always prevent someone from functioning at work, is that true? Does that fit with the research or the definition of mania?
That is not true. It's not true with the definition of bipolar disorder. It's not true with mania, and it's not true with my own personal experience in treating patients with bipolar disorder that are very high functioning and can function very well, even during manic episodes. And they actually will report that they like the manic episodes because they can stay more focused and achieve more.
Now, are you treating patients now that, or have you treated recently patients who have bipolar 1 and who are working and functioning?
I have.
Or now just yes or no?
Yes, I have. Throughout the years, I have. Multiple.
And what sorts of, are they able to have advanced careers, or are these people who are able to maybe work at McDonald's or something like that?
Combination, but I've certainly had very high achieving individuals. I've had nurses, teachers, attorneys with bipolar 1 disorder that are very high functioning individuals. Graduate students, I've evaluated graduate students, individuals that are working on a higher level education that I am diagnosing with bipolar disorder or treating for bipolar disorder symptoms. So bipolar disorder does not necessarily mean that you're not going to be able to lead a full productive life. It's on the contrary, there are many, many individuals that are very high functioning with the illness.
And is it part of your role as a consulting editor to keep up with the research and to see the research as it's coming in?
It is. It's most definitely, it's part of my responsibility. I think it's also one of the things that I think keeps me well informed, because I am being sent manuscripts of the research that's being conducted out there, like now, and what they're finding, and what populations, and what they're seeing. And so I don't have to go look for the research comes to me.
If Dr. Huey testified that you cannot have delusions in bipolar disorder without the more extreme manic symptoms, is that correct?
That's incorrect, because the diagnostic criteria for bipolar disorder is basically that in order for somebody to be in a manic episode, they either have to require hospitalization, that's one of them, or their level of functioning, like for example at work and socially, is impaired, it's 2, or, and it doesn't say and, it says or, the person is psychotic. And psychosis would be, in this case, the hallucinations, the hearing the voices and seeing the angel and the demon, and then also the delusion. That is psychosis. And what the DSM actually says, is that by definition, if somebody is psychotic, by definition, that qualifies as a manic episode. So all that means is if the person has experienced a manic episode that morphed, that turned into a delusion, the fact that the person has a delusion means that they are still manic. You may not see it, but by definition they're still manic. And it also means that their functioning is in fact impaired.
Okay. Let's talk about the symptoms for a manic episode. Did you is there a chart that you have prepared or asked to have prepared for the jury on the symptoms of hypermania and mania?
There is. I think it'll be important for us to look at it.
Your Honor, I would ask to use a Defendant's Exhibit 40, a chart for demonstrative purposes only.
Any objection to 40?
Only as to the relevance in a SIR rebuttal situation.
And lawyer's approach. All right, you may continue. With the Assistant Deputy Moore, ladies and gentlemen, you've been going for about an hour. I'm going to go ahead and give you your morning stretch break. Deputy Moore, just have them back in the jury box in 10 minutes. Thanks, sir.
All rise. You may be seated.